when you answer the lexical question for English language, there are a few other features that you can talk about that aren't just about word classes. Some of these are ones that you'll probably have covered at GCSE, so register, lexical fields, figurative language. You may well know those terms anyway, but it's very easy to sort of forget them at A level. But if you talk about them in the right way, you can actually advance your analysis quite a bit if you link these features to the word classes that you found, and link them, maybe even occasionally in the grammatical question to wider grammatical features. You can actually further your analysis and talk about another sort of layer of meaning. So register, you may well have covered this at school. His register is all about the formality of the words used. So if something's high register, what that means is it's formal. Often the words are polysyllabic, so they're more than one syllable. Sometimes it's for a more educated audience, although don't just look at, if there's long words and straight away say, oh, it must be for older people or an educated audience. Texts have much more specific purposes. You want to avoid those sweeping statements. And similarly, if a text is low register, generally that means it's less formal. Often the words will be monosyllabic. Sometimes that is for a less educated audience, but equally sometimes it's for children, or sometimes a text will be written in a relatively lower register, with lots of high frequency, lots of common words that we use all the time, just to be as clear as possible, just to hit as wide an audience as possible. It's not about being for people who aren't educated, it's just to hit as many people as possible, to make sure it appeals to everyone. And then other two words you may have come across: jargon is language only understood by a specific audience, so a doctor will use medical jargon, that rather than saying you have a broken bone in your leg, they might say what the bone is, for example. But it's not language that's understood by everyone. And colloquial language actually is sort of the same, except it's the informal version. It's deliberately informal slang language that people might use, but actually, like jargon, it's done to target particular audiences. If you're deliberately using slang or colloquial language, you're probably trying to say something about yourself, which is great then for representation and positioning. The key things you want to look for: you don't want to just say this text is high register or low register and stop there. You want to look for shifts, so at the moments where it's more formal, less formal. Why? And look at how the formality sort of functions. So how does that formality position the reader, or position the speaker or writer, and how does it help represent themselves or the topic? If you can link it to something contextual and link it to other linguistic features, you can probably say something. Figurative language, fairly straightforward. You've probably done this before. A simile, when you compare things using like or as. A metaphor, when you compare them but don't use like or as, so you apply a word or phrase figuratively rather than literally. You don't, if you say the angry wind, the wind isn't really angry. It's a way of metaphorically speaking about it. That also then links onto personification, when you describe something as non-human as though it is human. So that's a particular type of metaphor when you're actually giving something human qualities. And then the opposite, which you sometimes get, zoomorphism or animal imagery, you may have called it, when you apply animal characteristics for a human. So, the woman barked at me. Yeah, so she didn't literally bark, but it sounded like a bark, and it actually does the opposite of personification. It takes a human and makes them seem less human. If you want to avoid being too GCSE, there's two key things you need to do. One is link it to other technical aspects with terminology. So if you link it to a particular type of adjective that's used alongside a particular pronoun, alongside a particular adverb, and you're linking those things together, then that is okay. If you're just saying, there's a metaphor on its own, that's when it's less good. And you want to link to function. Again, how does it represent the issue? How does it position the audience or the author? How is power displayed or exaggerated or reduced? So the woman barked, for example, it represents her in a certain way, and it perhaps takes some power away from her, or in certain contexts you could argue it gives her power. It shows the threat that she poses. Right, lexical fields and semantic fields. Don't get too hung up on which one's which. Some people will use them interchangeably, but speaking more technically, a lexical field is a group of words that are almost more literally linked to each other. So I've picked out there: referee, goal, pitch. They're all words to do with football, but they are things that are to do with football. They are items or places or people that you would find in the game of football. So that's a lexical field. Semantic field is more about ideas. So they demonstrate the same idea or feeling or mood. So trapped, prisoner, guarded. They all suggest confinement. They're not items, or things that you would find in a prison necessarily. You wouldn't find the concept of being guarded in a prison, but they suggest the idea of confinement. So that's a semantic field. Key thing to remember here: accurately label the words in the field. So don't just go the word whatever and the word whatever and the word whatever are in a lexical or semantic field. Label what type of words each of them are, and some might be adverbs, some might be adjectives, some might be nouns, some might be verbs. And the other thing to avoid, don't point out an obvious field. So, for example, if a text is about a war, then obviously you'll have a lexical field and probably a semantic field of war. If it's a news story about a war, you're going to get words like shots, guns, army. Of course you are. And so I wouldn't bother labelling that, because of course it's got that lexical field, because that's what it's about. But if it's about a relationship and you get a semantic field of war, that would be interesting. If you describe two people in a relationship as though they were going into battle or as though they were firing words at each other, that would be one to talk about. So hopefully, to illustrate it, I've got two extracts of text that I've been using, one from The Guardian, one from The Sun. So on the face of it, you might go The Guardian would be high register because it's for educated older people, and The Sun would be different. There are those tendencies, but I think be careful. Yeah, that's a bit of an oversimplification, because The Guardian does use some monosyllabic words. The Sun actually at times is maybe more complex than you might expect. So the ones I've highlighted in green, they are the semantic field or lexical field that you probably want to avoid talking about. So Boris Johnson, Conservative, Tories, Majority Party. That's just, that involves here. I'd say in this case a lexical field. It's actual words, isn't it, rather than concepts that are used in politics. Majority, I think, would even fall into that category. Of course, you're going to get a lexical field of politics, because that's what the text is about. So there would be no point saying there's a lexical field of politics. Of course there is. That's what this text is about. What you want to look at, though, are others. So, for example, landscape and map. Well, I'd say there you've got a bit of a lexical field here to do with kind of navigating or finding your way. That is a much more interesting one, because it's about how suddenly we've got clarity and something The Guardian, actually we've got a direction that The Guardian doesn't really like. That's a far more interesting one to talk about. I like the metaphor there, the centre of the stage as well, as though this is a big theatre, sort of... Not quite mocking politics, but suggesting there's a theatrical element here. This is a big momentous day. We get other things going on here. Enduring, triumph, seized. I think broadly high register words, aren't they? You've got the Greek, Latin, French words here. Not the Anglo-Saxon, not the monosyllabic words, generally speaking. But equally, not words. There's not really jargon here. These are words that could be understood by most people reading it. So it's still designed for a very wide audience. And then you do get a first past the post second referendum. I think perhaps I wouldn't call them jargon, but they're moving that way, aren't they? They're quite specific phrases or terms that you probably need to know a little bit about politics to get. And that's where that would be interesting, because that implies the audience kind of understand it. There's an implication. It positions the audience in a certain way that gives them power. It suggests, we don't need to explain this. You know what it is. So that's where I think you could talk here about the register. And like I say, not quite jargon, but certainly subject-specific lexis. It's lexis to do very clearly with politics, but not the ones in green that actually would be understood by everyone. These are maybe a little bit more complex. And then the reference at the end to Edmund Burke, which wouldn't be understood by many people, or many people outside of the Guardian's intended readership. And then magnanimity, probably the longest word in there. I think these are the ones I think that you might talk about that do shift that register up. It's a little bit into the article when they come, perhaps because if you want to talk about context of reception, how we'd read it, probably because there'll be casual readers who just want to get the information right at the start, and those who are reading a bit longer are going to be more interested. So we get a bit of a shift towards more high register, more subject specific lexis later on. The Sun is different, but not entirely different. Notice, again, I've got socialist election in green. Yes, there's a semantic field of politics. Of course there is, but what would you what would you say about that? Well, the text about politics. So of course there is. But we get interesting sort of register shifts here. Notice, cause I was the deliberate, shift to a more low register language, the deliberate colloquialism there. Notice in the, I think, fourth paragraph, would have been if Labour had got a result. Again, talking about it in quite a low register way, quite a colloquial way. So it is very chatty. But I think just saying, oh, that's because, the Sun's audience aren't educated is a bit of a misstep. That's not all this is about, because notice what we get lefties, we get Corbynistas, not that different really from the Guardian, perhaps a little bit easier to understand, but again, subject specific lexis that positions the audience as knowing what these things are and having a certain view. Socialist fantasies is quite a good example there, isn't it? These people are bonkers, so it positions the audience in a certain way who think that these people are ridiculous. Notice that metaphor, the fantasies were in tatters, but the enjoyment of it, these are a load of rubbish. It's like he's ripped them up. Niche bellowed there, not quite zoomorphism, but suggests he's kind of out of control, doesn't it? Notice a bit later on, he made me howl with laughter. Again, a little bit bordering on zoomorphism here. Ali Ross suggesting that actually he himself lost control at how amazing this was. But be careful, we get dilemma, we get jeopardy later on. Again, Greek, Latin or French lexis that is polysyllabic. That is not maybe what you might expect if you just went, it's for the Sun, it's for people of a certain educational level. That's balanced with would have and got a result. But you do get that the higher register language. I think it's as Ali Ross is saying to the audience, you get this, I trust you, you're intelligent people. It's those socialists who are idiots. Whereas the Guardian represents Edmund Burke in a certain way as being a wise person to refer to. Not everyone reading would know who he was. Lewis Goodall is referenced in this one. Okay, it's a slightly different reference, but it's the same thing. It's only going to be understood by a certain audience, and again we get it a little bit lower down. And then you get stupid, a relatively low register term, but then left-wing bias, something that again is more subject specific. So Ali Ross is doing something very similar, gradually speaking to a more, I guess, direct audience, more an audience who's more capable of coping with the more subject specific lexis, but it's balanced with deliberately low register informal things for Ali Ross to essentially suggest to the audience, you're normal people just like me, we're friends, let's joke about these idiotic people. That's what Ali Ross is trying to imply. So yes, they are different, but equally there's a lot of similarities in what they do, and I think that's how you can talk about register, semantics, and fields in a way that is hopefully quite useful for you.